Although the idea may seem archaic to the school children of today, it really wasn't that long ago that corporal punishment played a major role in school systems all across both the United States and the United Kingdom. There are many, many people still around today who grew up getting spanked and caned in school as a form of punishment. And while sometimes it's important to view these more unsavory features of human history with a bit of nuance, occasionally you come across an individual that makes that really, really difficult. Allow me to introduce you to Eric A. Wildman, the president of the Society for the Retention of Corporal Punishment, a London-based organization built around the idea that physical discipline is necessary for the proper upbringing and education of a child. Now, at first, you might assume that I'm singling out Mr. Wildman because he believed in a particularly severe or cruel form of corporal punishment. But no, in actuality, his views on the subject were pretty typical for the time period. According to Wildman, students should be spanked specifically on the bottom with an open hand or a cane of some kind. No punching and no hitting on the hands or anywhere else that might cause lasting damage. Of course, today, that kind of thinking has mostly been exercised from the English school systems, but back in the 1940s and 50s, Wildman was far from an extremist. So, if he wasn't any more cruel than his contemporaries, then why am I setting up Wildman in particular as a villain, right? Well, the answer has less to do with his general advocacy for corporal punishment and a whole lot more to do with his enthusiasm and his showmanship. See, if you were an English schoolboy back in the day, then Eric A. Wildman might as well have been your boogeyman. He was constantly making headlines and constantly engaging in all kinds of crazy publicity stunts. Just look at this picture of him posed with his extensive collection of canes. Or look at this picture of him talking to his secretary with his wall of corporal punishment tools set up behind him. Or look at this picture of Wildman dressed up like a school teacher, smoking a pipe and carrying a signboard around that says, "Abolish the birch and crime increases." It is hard to imagine that this guy didn't realize just how nefarious he came across in pretty much every single picture. Like, take it from me, it is a challenge to find an image of Eric Wildman that doesn't make him look like the bad guy from a Disney movie that came out in the 50s. Like, remember that headshot that I first used to introduce Wildman? Well, even that was just a cropped version of yet another picture of Eric brandishing his instruments. I literally could not find even one simple, straight-on picture of Wildman just looking like a normal guy. He is posed like this in pretty much every single picture. But all that said, it definitely wasn't just publicity that Wildman was after. In addition to his Society for the Retention of Corporal Punishment, Eric Wildman was also the head of the CoopÄ Educational Supply Company, CoopÄ being short for corporal punishment, of course. And what this company did was sell canes and paddles to schools all across the world. That is why Wildman had mountains of canes up on the walls in every picture. He's selling them to Uganda and Persia and Palestine and plenty more places all around the globe. According to Wildman, the CoopÄ Supply Company serviced 300 schools in total in 1947 and then 10,000 schools 6 years later in 1953, which I have to admit sounds like a pretty dubious number when you consider that the entire staff of Wildman's company was just him and a few secretaries. Maybe he actually was sending canes to that many schools all around the world, but I kind of doubt it. Although, in that 10,000 school quote, Wildman isn't just talking about canes. He also mentions the literature component of the CoopÄ company. And if he meant to say that he just mailed his educational publications to 10,000 schools, then that I can believe. because this guy loved to distribute pamphlets. Twice a month, he published 2 separate periodicals that were supposedly rife with spelling errors and utterly redundant. Every single issue was reportedly just the exact same thing, poorly written arguments for corporal punishment, regurgitated over and over and over again. And if that wasn't enough, Wildman also gave lectures. All the time, he was running ads in local newspapers and putting up flyers on notice boards for talks and meetings that would often end in total disaster because the only attendees would be hardcore supporters and hardcore opponents of corporal punishment who were basically just there to have screaming matches with one another. Like, overall, reading about Eric Wildman inevitably paints a picture of a man who was utterly obsessed with spectacle. Even his sales catalog was full of pizzazz. He titled his catalog Good News for School Teachers, and he would come up with all these ridiculous names for his canes, like Dragon Smoky Malacca or Indian Nilgrihi, which is a totally made-up word as far as I can tell. I think maybe Wildman was trying to reference the Nilgiri mountain range in India and just completely butchered the name, but genuinely, who knows? Oh, and of course, once you pick out your cane, you can also choose a hand strap that comes in one of 5 colors. As wild as all that is, though, overwhelmingly, the single best source of evidence on Eric Wildman's peculiarities comes from a book on the history of corporal punishment called Chastisement Across the Ages. This book came out in 1956, and it's got an entire section on Eric Wildman that is just chock full of gems. The author seems to have some kind of personal familiarity with Wildman, or at the very least, he consulted with people who knew Wildman personally, because we get some very detailed writing here. So, according to the book, Eric Wildman was a deadly serious man with the eyes of a fanatic, a complete obsessive who literally saw himself as an apostolic figure put on earth with a mission to preserve the institution of corporal punishment. Eric Wildman was afflicted by a messianic conceit and a severe case of megalomania. He was constantly moving between buildings because his landlords weren't particularly thrilled about housing a guy whose office looked like some barbaric chieftain's tent because of all the weapons hanging up on the walls. The book even goes so far as to imply that Wildman suffered some head injuries when he was younger, and that is why he was so entirely consumed by this obsession with corporal punishment. What a picture of the man those passages paint. Holy cow. But okay. I feel like it's just about time that we get to the main event of the video. What I want to do now is tell you a story in which Eric A. Wildman finally gets a little taste of his own medicine. But real quick, before I do, I want to make sure that you're really itching to see this guy get his comeuppance. So let me show you just one last quote from Wildman. In December of 1948, a magazine asked Eric Wildman about his own 18-month-old daughter, and this is what he said. "She is too young for caning yet, but I have some beautiful canes waiting for her in a few years' time." All right, so our story starts in November of 1948, when Mr. Wildman received an invitation to give a lecture on corporal punishment to the students of Horsley Hall, a small private school located just a few hours away from London. Of course, Wildman accepted the invitation, and he made his way up to Horsley Hall, where he met with the school's headmaster, a man named Robert Copping. And here we have a very nice picture of Wildman excitedly showing off his canes to Copping. And Copping, by the way, seemed to be exactly the kind of headmaster that Wildman advocated for. He ran his school like the military. Wildman was amazed at the level of discipline. CoopÄ must have been some kind of devil for corporal punishment. And so, feeling motivated by his meeting with a kindred spirit, Eric Wildman climbed up on stage, looked into the crowd of students, smiled at the 16 journalists and photographers who were there to cover the event, and then he launched into his lecture on the merits of corporal punishment. And before long, after about 20 minutes of talking, Wildman seemed to hit a high point in his speech. He held up a bunch of his canes in his hand, and he said, "The most reasonable punishment is 6 of the best," meaning 6 smacks with the cane, of course. And as soon as those words left Wildman's mouth, the room absolutely exploded. 3 boys shouted, "Come on, kids," and leapt onto the stage, where they grabbed the legs of Wildman's chair and flipped him onto the ground right into the waiting arms of a seething mass of children. One kid grabbed his head, and another pinned down his legs, and before long, those kids had Eric Wildman laying flat on the ground with his coat pulled up to reveal his posterior. And from here, I'm sure you can guess what happened next. Those kids picked up one of Wildman's own canes and gave him 7 strokes to the place provided by nature. And then they let him go, and old Mr. CoopÄ, the school's headmaster, walked up to Wildman and handed him £2 for his lecture fee. Supposedly, Wildman stormed out of the building and ran straight to the local hospital, where he started screaming, "I've been beaten by boys!" But the staff just kind of laughed at him, and so Wildman left and slunk away back to London. But, of course, because all those journalists attended the event, Wildman's embarrassment was far from over. In the days following the ambush, newspapers all across the world printed pictures of Wildman getting mobbed by the Horsley Hall students. Just look at this spectacular image. It's almost like a painting. That there is Wildman in the middle of getting tackled, cane in hand, struggling in vain against the wave of children trying to haul him to the ground. And if that's not enough, a lot of papers also ran this picture of Wildman literally laying on the floor, presumably right after receiving his spanking. He's sprawled across the ground with his precious canes in a mess around him, and one of the students wielding a cane threateningly. Like, this is just such a crazy picture to have put in the newspaper. So at this point, I'm sure you're wondering what exactly happened here, right? Well, the answer is that from the beginning, the entire event was a sham orchestrated by Headmaster CoopÄ. Quite literally, the whole lecture was a trap designed to embarrass Wildman. See, Horsley Hall was actually a free expression school, where students enjoyed a lot of freedom and corporal punishment was strictly forbidden. Presumably, CoopÄ and his students had read about Wildman in the newspapers or something, and they decided to give him a taste of what he so freely advocates for children. And so they started concocting a plan and invited him up to the school. And let me tell you, they really, really committed to this scam. Like, remember how Wildman was impressed with how much of a disciplinarian CoopÄ appeared to be? Well, apparently, CoopÄ actually told his students to act all like super proper and tightly wound, literally just to try and lull Wildman into a false sense of security. And he even went so far as to have his kids go out and collect a bunch of sticks from the woods or something so that CoopÄ could show Wildman the sticks and be like, "Here's my corporal punishment tools that I use on my students." But to be honest, as funny as that is, CoopÄ probably didn't really need all those extra theatrics because Wildman just seemed totally oblivious to how weird this whole situation was. Like, many of the newspapers who wrote articles about this story seemed kind of baffled that Wildman apparently didn't think it was strange that like 1 billion journalists would show up to a tiny private school for a random speech about corporal punishment. Like, of course, Copping was the one who invited all those journalists because he told them that something exciting was going to happen. But Wildman didn't know that. Apparently, to him, it made perfect sense that 16 journalists would come from miles around to get the scoop on his riveting speech. Of course, Wildman also threatened to sue for the attack, but Copping welcomed that too, saying that if Wildman wants, he can sue us for damages for receiving the same treatment that he was at the very moment advocating for children. But Wildman didn't actually end up suing. He just went back to his supply company and he kept selling canes all the way up until 1967 when he finally closed up shop. A real long career peddling in pain. But at the very least, for that brief moment in 1947, Eric Wildman felt the sting of his own Dragon Smoky Malacca. Or Smoky Dragon, as this newspaper called it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.